faith. Psalm 19, verse 7 is the first scripture I'm going to read. And Psalm 19:7. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. And then Psalm 119, verse 130, just one verse from this long psalm. Psalm 119, verse 130. As your words are taught, they give light. Even the simple can understand them. You know, when I read Psalm 19:7 and then Psalm 119:30, and it says that they're for the simple, and even the simple can understand them, I thank the Lord because I am simple.
Amen.
And simple faith is really what God is looking for. If we start to get into our own wisdom or theological, we can trip ourselves up.
Yeah.
Simple faith doesn't mean ignorance. It means taking God at His word.
Yeah.
And that's all the Lord is looking for. Take me at my word. Because you know what? When the Lord tells us something, gives us a direction, He gives it to us simply. He gives it to us whatever level we need to understand it. If you search God out with your intellect, you're going to fall short. Presented on the surface, the gospel message and the Bible as a whole doesn't make a lot of sense to the human intellect. So when you try to find God through thought process, or you pick up a book because you want God proven to you, some people have done that and found God, but it's not because of their intellect. It's only through faith, simple faith. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians 1, I'm going to read 18 to 22. I know very well how foolish the message of the cross sounds to those who are on the road to destruction. But we who are being saved recognize this message as the very power of God. As the scriptures say, I will destroy human wisdom and discard their most brilliant ideas. So where does this leave the philosophers, the scholars, and the world's brilliant debaters? God has made them all look foolish and has shown their wisdom to be useless nonsense. Since God in His wisdom saw to it that the world would never find Him through human wisdom, He has used our foolish preaching to save all who believe. God's way seems foolish to the Jews, but they want a sign from heaven to prove it is true. And it is foolish to the Greeks because they believe only what agrees with their own wisdom. Here it's showing us what trips people up. Those verses tell us why people don't have faith in God. And it gives two main reasons. The Jews wanted proof. God, if you are real, show me. And people have asked God that, and sometimes He's shown them. But I believe He's shown them because they asked in faith. But most of the time you say, God, show me this or give me this sign, and you're not going to get it. The Jews, and the problem with what the Jews were asking is He had given them hundreds of signs. The signs were already there. So when you're asking God for a sign, don't look for a sign that is going to come. Look for a sign that's already there. Look for a sign, first of all, of your very life. Your breathing. Look at His creation. Look at everything that God has done. That's enough of a sign. Simple faith says, okay, Lord, and, well, we'll get into that for the second point. Simple faith, okay, Lord, you said it. There was a bumper sticker, I think it was back in the 80s, maybe 90s. It says, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And it really is that simple. Unfortunately, it's way easier to put a sticker on your bumper and drive around with it than it is to apply that in our life. But if we apply that in our life, we don't need to go past that. God said this, so I believe it's true, and it's settled. Hope is huge. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Because one of the things God has been showing me recently is that in our world today, one of the areas Satan has really got a good foothold is in making people hopeless. And there's such a stirring in the earth today, in many nations, including our own. There's such a stirring that many people have lost hope for the future. And it's not people that are adults and have lived some years and have given up hope. We have a youth, we have a generation that many I'll say a majority are hopeless for their future. Hebrews 11:13. All these faithful ones died without receiving what God had promised them. But they saw it all from a distance and welcomed the promises of God. They agreed that they were no more than foreigners and nomads here on earth. So here we're talking about people who had great faith, but it was simple faith. And what God told them they would receive and what they would have, they never got here on this earth. Matter of fact, for many of them, they never even got close. It was far, far, far away. But because they had simple faith, they believed God. And they saw it at a distance. And they died with that faith of knowing that everything God had promised them, everything that they were going to receive. And some of them, that hope, what it was not just for them, it was for generations to come. Yeah. So Abraham's promise, we're still living that out today. We are part of Abraham's promise. So that hope we have, that hope for our children and our children's children, when God has shown you that there's going to be salvation in your line, it's going to be there. We may not be there to see it, but it's going to be there. So that hope of God is going to keep every promise that He makes. Point number 2. I'm going to read Romans 10, 16 and 17. Romans 10, 16 and 17. But not everyone welcomes the good news. For Isaiah the prophet said, Lord, who has believed our message? Yet faith comes from listening to this message of good news, the good news about Christ. So where does faith come from? It's definitely not something you could buy. There's people who've tried to purchase it. There's people who have gone to other human beings and said, give me faith. That faith you have, give it to me. And those people of faith said, I can't give it to you, but I know the one who can. And you bring them to Christ. It's not a formula or an understanding. You can't get it intellectually. There's no book that you could read that will give you faith. You know, this book will not give you faith. The Bible, you can't read the Bible. I used to read the Bible with no faith, and it was like reading a book in the total darkness. It was like reading a book with the middle of the night, all the lights out, where you can't even see the words. Because that's how much I understood it. I'm reading these words, and there was no understanding. Because I didn't have faith. And I believe, now this is this is one that there's differing beliefs, but I believe that anybody who wants faith, God will give it to them. I believe His Holy Spirit searches the world over on a continuous basis, and when He sees a heart with just a tiny little opening, what does it say? The faith, the size of the seed of a mustard seed? Just that tiny bit of desire to know God. That's what faith is. Faith is, I want to know you, God. He puts that in you, and that starts the process. I believe that's what happened in my life. Is I wanted to know God. I didn't know how to reach God. I'm reading this Bible and understanding nothing, and all of a sudden God put some faith in me, and everything spiraled from there. It's the only way is... Well, I'll say it the way I wrote it. Faith is simply a gift from God that we receive. And the faith that comes from hearing isn't a hearing from our ears, but from our hearts. We know the only real hearing is in our hearts, right? Yeah. That's why Jesus said many times, those who have ears, let them hear. Well, everybody has ears. So faith is that we hear in our heart. Because how many people hear with their ears the message of God? And the reason it's rejected, if you reject it, is because you haven't heard it in your heart. Because your heart does not want God. So when you hear a message of God's goodness, you may even see and acknowledge that there is a God and that He's created the world. You might believe that there's a God who created the world. But if you don't want to receive Him, you're going to cut Him off. Between your ears and your heart, you're going to cut Him off. And you're not going to hear in your heart. You're not going to see in your heart what needs to be seen. Some ask the question, but what about people who haven't heard the good news? I'm going to go back to Psalm 19. And I read verse 7, but now I'm going to read verses 1 through 7 in Psalm 19 to help answer this question. Psalm 19, 1 through 7. The heavens heavens tell of the glory of God. The skies display his marvelous craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make him known. They speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is silent in the skies. Yet their message has gone out to all the earth, and their words to all the world. The sun lives in the heavens where God placed it. It bursts forth like a radiant bridegroom after his wedding. It rejoices like a great athlete eager to run the race. The sun rises at one end of the heavens and follows its course to the other end. Nothing can hide from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. So in other words, any human being, no matter what our intellect is, what level of intellect he's given us, all we have to do is look and see creation and know God. So he said there's none with an excuse. So when you say, what about people who haven't heard the good news? We could say simply there aren't any. Everybody's heard the good news in one way or another. Because, many people have died, first of all, before the gospel was ever there. But even since Jesus came, there's many who died who never were told the gospel. There's still places where it hasn't been reached. The whole world, we think, because America is the way it is, and we have all this communication, all this ease of travel, we think the rest of the world is like this. There's places in the world, there's people who have never heard of Jesus Christ. Not even, one sentence or anything, not a history lesson, nothing. And, it says that he's going to come when all have heard. Well, there's still places and people who have not heard. But it says that everyone hears just through seeing creation. So don't feel like, and that's a very simple answer, because one of the things when you dialogue with people is, well, what about? But what about the Jews? Have they actually heard the message? Yes, they have. The message of God's creation has gone out to everyone, and its words to all the world. But did the people of Israel really understand? Another question it's good to ask. Well, they heard it, but did they really understand? Yes, they did. For even in the time of Moses, God had said, I will rouse your jealousy by blessing our other nations. I will make you angry by blessing the foolish Gentiles. Man, that covers all of us, I think. Except for maybe half of Joel. Foolish Gentiles. Hope there's no pride, because this shoots our pride right down. This is God calling us foolish Gentiles. And later Isaiah spoke boldly for God. I was found by people who were not looking for me. I showed myself to those who were not asking for me. Their pain is our gain. It sounds tough. If I was Jewish, I wouldn't really like that message. Because I'm a Gentile, I'm really happy that he chose to use us to make them jealous. But the point is that any Jew who wants to know Jesus has received Jesus. And we know there's going to be a time to come. I'm not going to get into all that today, but God has a plan. And this is going to take me to point 3. Where does faith come from was point 2. And it just comes from God revealing himself to all people. There is nobody who's going to stand before God and say, I didn't ever have a chance to know you or receive you. There is nobody. Everybody, it says, is without excuse. Point number 3, God is sovereign. I'm going to stay in Romans right here, 10, and I'm just going to pick up where I left off. I'm going to read verse 21 through chapter 11, verse 12. This is point 3. It's the last point. God is sovereign. But regarding Israel, God said, all day long I opened my arms to them, but they kept disobeying me and arguing with me. I asked them, has God rejected his people, the Jews? Of course not. Remember that I myself am a Jew, a descendant of Abraham, and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. No, God has not rejected his own people, whom he chose from the beginning. Do you remember what the scriptures say about this? Elijah the prophet complained to God about the people of Israel and said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I alone am left, and now they are trying to kill me too. And do you remember God's reply? He said, you are not the only one left. I have 7,000 others who have never bowed down to Baal. I'm going to continue, but that's a great point in just remembering when we think we're kind of alone or isolated, or God, how come I'm the only one? What did he say to Elijah? You're not the only one. There's 7,000 others. It is the same today, for not all the Jews have turned away from God. A few are being saved as a result of God's kindness in choosing them. And if they are saved by God's kindness, then it is not by their good works. For in that case, God's wonderful kindness would not be what it really is, free and undeserved. So this is the situation. Most of the Jews have not found the favor of God they are looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones God has chosen, but the rest were made unresponsive. As the scriptures say, God has put them into a deep sleep. To this very day he has shut their eyes so they do not see, and closed their ears so they do not hear. David spoke of the same thing when he said, let their bountiful table become a snare, a trap that makes them think all is well. Let their blessings cause them to stumble. Let their eyes go blind so they cannot see, and let their backs grow weaker and weaker. Did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. His purpose was to make his salvation available to the Gentiles, and then the Jews would be jealous and want it for themselves. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because the Jews were turned down, or because the Jews turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when the Jews finally accept it. We're still waiting for that day. But in our case, we got brought in, and here's the plan about God's sovereignty. Well, none of it was accidental. He didn't choose Israel by accident. He chose them knowing they were going to reject him. He chose them knowing he was going to come through the Jews to this earth when he took on his human form. It was all part of his plan. Well, guess what? His plan didn't stop 2,000 years ago. His plan is still going on today, as Pastor Bill was talking about. Our expectation, what we need to expect is God's plan for our life. And he said, step into it. So all we need to do is step into it. Any lack we have is because we're not right with God. And the lack could be something we think we're lacking when it really might be a lack of attitude or a lack of contentment. We may already have everything we need, and it's different for every person. Some people, they're lacking something that God is going to give them. Other people, they're only lacking the attitude to be content with what God has already assigned them. And maybe they're in that assignment, but they want a different one. And they're not happy with God's call on their life, in whatever area it might be. He's sovereign. Simple faith means not having to have every question answered. I'd like you to just think in your mind, are you okay with God just telling you to do something and not explaining why or what or how it's going to turn out? Let's go to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1, 25 through 27. God has given me the responsibility of serving his church by proclaiming his message in all its fullness to you Gentiles. This message was kept secret for centuries and generations past, but now it has been revealed to his own holy people. For it has pleased God to tell his people that the riches and glory of Christ are for you Gentiles too. For this is the secret. Christ lives in you, and this is your assurance that you will share in his glory. So Paul was given a secret to tell the people, not only the Gentiles, he was to tell it to the Jews too. The Jews didn't like his secret so much. But he's talking about a secret or a mystery. The Bible many times talks about a mystery that was revealed, and it was the revelation of Jesus. Are we all right with secrets? Are we all right with God withholding from us? Are we all right that there's going to be things God tells us to do, he assigns us, that we're never going to know the why? Even when we're at the end of it, we're not going to know the why. That's trusting in God's sovereignty. And I think there's the lack of simple faith. One of the big signs would be not trusting God's sovereignty. Putting limitations on God, telling God, I will do this if you do that. That's one of the things about asking for a sign. God's sovereignty is just a total trust in God. God is sovereign, and our faith allows us to be content that what we know is limited by God. There's still some things that God hasn't revealed. Personally, in every person's life, he withholds some things. I know as a parent, there's things my children will never know about my life. On purpose. For their own good. And there's some things that I reveal to them as I know they can handle it. So, if I have my son who's 18 and maybe going off to college, we're going to have a conversation I would not have with my 5-year-old going off to kindergarten. That's how God deals with us. Amen. He gives it to us as we need it, as He knows it's not going to hurt us, and as He knows it's going to be a benefit that we need to know this, or He needs to show us this. That's His sovereignty. That's good. Simple faith says, I'm all right with that, God, because you're taking care of me by doing that way. Not I'm 5 years old and I want you to treat me like I'm 18. Understanding that God will never give us more than we can handle. But He'll never give us less than what we need. I'm going to read Matthew 13. I got 2 scriptures to close. Matthew 13, 31 and 32. Here is another illustration Jesus used. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It is the smallest of seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants and grows into a tree where birds can come and find shelter in its branches. Simple faith grows. It doesn't stay small. Just like it says here in the illustration of the mustard seed. The mustard seed is tiny, and it was the tiniest known seed. They found some that are smaller now, but because Jesus was speaking to the people it was the very tiniest seed they knew of at that time. So that initial faith is tiny, but it says it becomes the largest of garden plants and grows into a tree where birds can come. Our faith should always be growing. Our trust should always be growing. Our willingness to accept God's sovereignty should always be growing. It's not going to come natural. It's part of that sanctification process. Is, okay, God, you've shown that I can trust you here, 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 and here, so I'm absolutely then going to trust you here. All right, closing, Job 37. Job 37, verses 11 to 15. He lulls the clouds with moisture, and they flash with His lightning. The clouds turn around and around under His direction. They do whatever He commands throughout the earth. He causes things to happen on earth, either as a punishment or as a sign of His unfailing love. Listen, Job. Stop and consider the wonderful miracles of God. Do you know how God controls the storm and causes the lightning to flash forth from His clouds? And number one, that's God's sovereignty. So who can tell me if Harvey and Irma were God's judgment? Raise your hand if you can tell me. Nobody knows? Man, a lot of people on Facebook know. I was reading those stupid things. First they show a preacher up there saying he absolutely knows it's God's judgment, maybe God's own, but then the dialogue after that, yes. This world's nuts. But I can tell you one thing, God knew all about it, and He's sovereign. That's right. And there were reasons they happened. And it may have been His judgment, and it may have been a sign of His unfailing love all at once. Because He did many great things. And you know how many testimonies and miracles came out of those situations? Right. But also devastation came. Right. That's simple faith, is accepting the sovereignty of God. It's a foolish faith or human intellect that says God should just make everything go just so. Guess what? He did. And we messed it up. Right. He made everything go just so. There was no evil in the world. It was a perfect place that humanity was living. And then sin came in, which brought all this in. God did not bring it in. He held up the floodgates of evil. He kept Satan out and created a world that was perfect. And then we brought the gate down and let it in. But guess what? He says, I'm not going to leave you there. And simple faith, this is our hope. He's not going to leave us here. Amen. He's going to restore it and put it back. And not even to the way it was. It says a new heaven and a new earth. Yes. He's going to bring perfection back, and He's going to have us live in that forever.